So I kind of think of this as everything everywhere all at once, which is I'm stealing from a movie. I don't know if you've seen this movie. So the 90s is like, it's a very exciting time to be a historian, actually. I don't know how many historians there are in this room, but it's the moment of all these turns. There's the linguistic turn, and the cultural turn, and the transnational turn. And what's interesting is that in Japanese history, all of these turns kind of come together and intersect with a really massive imperial turn. And I'll just give you two examples of this. There's so many, but one is the new cultural history of the empire. That you see all of a sudden so many studies of philosophy and literature and ideology, all the branches of the modern knowledge that are looking about at it, from a lens of empire. Just a fountain of books on the culture of empire and really showing how modern Japanese culture was forged in the crucible of empire. So this is one place where we see everything everywhere all at once in this canalization of the imperial turn and the cultural turn. Okay, another one is science and technology studies. And here the new environmental, we have the new environmental history, which again, that happens in all historical fields, the new environmental history, the new technological history, the new materialism. But in Japan, again, it's kind of inflected through empire. And so there's books on the commodities and imperialism, and on technology of empire, and on carbon imperialism, and changes in the soil that are created by imperial processes, and so on and so forth. So these things, science, technology, environment, are really big in other fields as well, but for Japan studies, the intersection between these new fields and imperial history is incredibly generative. So another thing that comes out of this empire boom, it sort of characterizes it, is its connection with colonial memory politics. And the new scholarship taps what was a long-delayed confrontation between Japan and its former colonies over all kinds of questions, but in particular reparations. Reparations for colonial violence, reparations for forced labor, reparations for sexual labor, the whole issue of the comfort women. I don't know if you've heard about that, but other sort of human rights crimes. These become real issues starting in the 90s. And they're also taken up by the Empire Boom Scholarship, which attempts to, which is influenced by all these pressing sort of questions, and then attempts to bring together scholars representing different sides on these very contentious issues to represent the different sides. And so what's really, there are just so many international conferences and joint projects, sort of transnational joint projects that come out, again, starting in the 90s. And it becomes a real common way of examining the history of colonialism from multiple perspectives, multiple subject positions. So you have different, these are just a few examples, but some of them are like looking at the empire from the Korean side and the Japanese side, where you bring a group of Chinese scholars and American scholars and Japanese scholars together to get all three perspectives. Or there's volumes that try to do, multiple empires with the British and the French and the Russian and the American and the Japanese all coming together to write about about history and colonialism, and to analyze both the Asian Pacific War and Japan's work on empire as it's told in each of these national histories. And so what the scholarship of the Empire Boom is really committed to this idea that the multilateral or multinational, multi-ethnic perspectives can produce mutual understanding and can resolve these tensions that are so at the surface. And they're also committed to the idea that all parties, all participants, everybody deserves a voice at the historical table. Okay, so now I'm going to come to the third part of my talk, which we're finally getting to interimperialism. And I wanted to talk to you about what this Empire Boom Scholarship offers us in terms of insights for this category of interimperialism. Now, interimperialism for me, this is kind of a new concept. It's a new idea. I was invited to a conference last year, and it's the first time I really encountered people working on interimperialism. And to me, it represents a new direction in global history and world history of empires. And the sort of starting point is, look, we cannot study empires in a vacuum. We need to see how one empire engages another or with several empires. And the benefit of this is it lets us look at flows that cross imperial boundaries. So flows of capital, or flows of commodities, flows of people, flows of knowledge, all of these things that actually really profoundly shape the mechanics of empire and make them work. So that's one reason that interimperialism is an important analytic. Another one is that it allows us to include the study of people and spaces that are usually left out of the story because they're not part of an empire. So there's all these people that are caught between empires in frontier zones or in borderlands or in contested regions. So when we look at the Japanese Empire in these terms, in its engagements and its intersections with other empires, what do we learn? So in the time that I have left, I'm going to highlight two kind of insights, two takeaways that emerge from this scholarship that I do think apply to other empires in other regions, and I think it would be interesting to hear more from you all if you have insights into some generative comparisons. So the first thing that I think is really interesting that comes away from in terms of interimperialism is that it gives us a roadmap for a post-nationalist history of the empire. And what I mean by post-nationalist is that we take the story of empire out of the straitjacket of the nation. And we can do this by reimagining we can reimagine the nation as an empire nation. And we can also do this by sort of conceiving the boundaries around the empire nation as porous and indeterminate. Okay, so that's all very, very abstract. So let me make it more concrete. The new imperial history makes the point that the Japanese nation and the Japanese empire were both founded at the very same time. And in fact, they are the same thing. The overthrow of the feudal state in 1868 ushers in this period of modernizing reforms that invent nationalism, they build the modern state, but they also set Japan on a path of expansionism. And this sort of revelation in this scholarship that the nation and the empire are the same thing completely changes the way that historians thought about or think about prefectures of Hokkaido in northern Japan and Okinawa in southern Japan. Previously, everybody wrote about Okinawa and Hokkaido as part of an internalist, a domestic history. They are two of 47 prefectures, and their stories mirrored the stories of the other 45. They had the same chronology. They were subject to the same dynamics. They held the same relationship to the central state. They experienced the same cultural shifts. So everything was in parallel. But now that we have the new imperial history that says, no. Hokkaido and Okinawa, they are Japan's first colonies. They are the first colonies of the empire nation. And we have to take really seriously why it is and how it is that they are annexed in the 1870s during this decade of the founding of the modern nation state. So the new imperial history focuses on the separate and divergent histories of these two regions and the ways that they actually had a very different relationship to the Japanese state and the Japanese homeland that was completely separate than the other 45 prefectures. And finally, this new scholarship tells the stories of Hokkaido and Okinawa from the perspective of indigenous populations, of the Ainu people in Hokkaido and the Okinawa people in Okinawa. So let me start by sort of focusing on Ezo, what used to be called Ezo, and that was renamed by the modern state as Hokkaido. So when we reimagine it in this way, we can look at the history of Ezo Hokkaido as a place that's actually caught between two empires. It's caught between the Russian Empire and the Japanese Empire. And the people that live there, the original population of the Ainu, also are caught between these two empires. So let me tell you this story. So from the 18th century, the Ainu people, and you can look at this map on the left, upper left, is a map of the purple is the sort of scope of their settlement. They had settlements in Ezo, which is now known as Hokkaido, but also in Sakhalin and in the Kuril Islands, which were part of the Russian Far East. And the Japanese state's drive to actually annex Hokkaido and to then engage in aggressive settler colonialism was a response to Russian expansionism into the Far East and the Russian presence in this area. So beginning in the 1870s, the Japanese state creates a colonization bureau. There's this sort of picture of it. And it begins to claim and survey Ainu lands and to redistribute them to Japanese settlers. They build colonial cities. They build transport networks to try to develop agricultural production in the region. They force the Ainu into permanent settlements under Japanese administration. And then Hokkaido serves as a stepping stone for further territorial ambitions out into the Russian Far East, in Sakhalin and in the Kuril Isles. And these become sort of territories that Japan and Russia, sort of colonialism, different forms of political and economic and settler colonialism on both sides compete for influence over. And so across the 19th and 20th century, and into the present day, because the story sort of continues, this is an area that Russia and Japan continue to compete over, and the border is still, Japan's northern border is still contested between Japan and Russia. So the point is that there's all these spaces that are naturalized within people, within nations, that actually you can think of in a different way. Think of them if we use an inter-imperial lens. Okinawa is another part of this story, also caught between different empires, initially between China and Japan, but then between America and Japan. And the China-Japan story goes back to the 15th and 16th century, when the Ryukyu Kingdom was a tributary state of China. But then, beginning in the 17th state, the southernmost domain of the Tokugawa Federation, Satsuma, begins to get sort of expansionist ambitions, and they try to establish a suzerainty relationship with the Ryukyu Kingdom. And the Ryukyu Kingdom was able to maintain this kind of strategic ambiguity in their positionality between, oh yes, we're a tributary state of you, China, and we're loyal to you as well, Satsuma. And that was possible until the 1870s with this emergence of the modern Japanese nation state. And then the Japanese Empire claims the Ryukyus, annexes them in the face of Chinese and Ryukyu kingdom protests. They did not want to be become part of Japan. But then this effort, the sort of continued pull of interimperialism, of competing contests over the loyalty of the kingdom, then really is one of the things that prompts the Japanese state to defensively engage in active settler colonialism, to make a lot of capital investments, to sort of really very aggressively stake their claim over Okinawa and assimilate and incorporate it. And they create, very much like the colonial state apparatus up in Hokkaido, they created a similar apparatus of colonial rule down in the kingdom. And also, you know, in the same way that this new interimperial sort of lens makes the Ainu story the center of their own story, rather than just sort of submerged under a Japanese national history, the Okinawan people can become the center of this story as well. And it's kind of the Okinawa people also, like the Ainu, had a different language. They had not been part of the Tokugawa Federation. And their continued sense of liminality, as well as the economic exploitation by Japan, becomes a really important part of separatist identity there. And in addition, the very extreme poverty and sort of dispossession that they experienced as a result of Japanese colonialism shaped a history of Okinawan migration. Okinawans are overrepresented in the migrations to the Japanese diaspora and migrations to the Americas and elsewhere. And it's really because of this sort of history of colonialism that we can understand that. So the last point about Okinawa is that in the 20th century, Okinawa becomes part of a new interimperial framework, and that is the one between America and Japan. So the United States occupies these southern islands of the Japanese archipelago during the end of World War II, the Battle of Okinawa, and then they stay there, and they create essentially a colonial state, colonial occupation. And America continued to occupy Okinawa and created a network of military bases, which you can see represented in this map here. These are the brown parts are let's see, what have I got of it there? I think. Yes, all the brown area, they've got the red is the air bases, and then the rest of it are also lands that are under U.S. Military occupation. So what's interesting here is that this dominant presence of American soldiers are part of an ongoing American base imperialism that has enormous social and economic and cultural and political impact on Okinawa and its relationship with mainland Japan. And so the insight, again, of this interimperialism framework is that it sort of makes the history visible. So we can look at this as an expression of how Okinawa is caught between Japanese and American colonialisms. So I think it's important to understand how this retelling of the story of Okinawa and Hokkaido as eternal colonies is part of the history of the nation empire. And it's an insight that we get from this post-nationalist historical perspective, because really prior to the 1990s, none of this was part of the way that people wrote about Okinawa and Hokkaido. Okay, the next thing that I want to talk about, this is the second insight, and then I'll be wrapping up, is the way that the empire boom really shapes post-colonial identity politics in Asia, as well as the phenomenon of Asian-on-Asian racisms. So the case of Japan and Asia, I think, is really interesting because it scrambles some of the ways that we have these racialized assumptions that have informed, in particular, post-colonial studies. because they show, the Japanese case shows how cultural colonization, Orientalism, and concepts of the other are not a monopoly of kind of a white-collared hierarchy or Euro-American race thinking. And also the resistances and the critiques of these positions are not solely pointed at Eurocentrism. So in other words, if we look at race in the Japanese Empire, we have to look at sort of intersections between different race regimes, or different regimes of race knowledge. So a European-based kind of race knowledge, but also divisions within Japan's ethnic mapping of Asia. And in this context, it's really important to know that in Japanese imperial ideology, Asia is not a single race. And in fact, there's many different sort of inter-Asian subjectivities that emerge under the empire that get called race. And so, for example, in the official ideology of Manchuria, of Manchukuo, it's harmony of the 5 races. That's the official ideology. And these 5 races are all Asian. So Japan in Asia then offers us a different template for thinking about ethnic pluralism in the empire and in post-empire, and new ways of conceptualizing the other. So the first place I think we can see this is in a stream of historical studies of race thinking in the empire that look at the way that race thinking is deployed both by Japanese rulers, but also deployed by colonial subalterns. And again, the sort of take-home point here is that in the Japanese setting, you don't have race isn't binary. It's not white, non-white. And some of the best work in this regard is about Taiwan. Taiwan is really such an interesting place to look at. And here you have, a lot of people aren't aware of this, but there's a very diverse Aboriginal indigenous population that inhabits the eastern part, this hill country of the island. And even though it was homogenized by Japanese colonial thought as all indigenous, actually the population is not at all homogeneous. And there are complex divisions and alliances completely confounded and confused Japanese colonial occupiers, and made it actually quite difficult for them to extend their control over this hill area. So that's the sort of indigenous population. But also the Chinese settlers are incredibly divided and complex as well. Han Chinese came to Taiwan as part of settler colonization from the 17th century onward. And but they came from different places in China, and they spoke different languages. So this created a sort of different linguistic communities in the Hakka and the Holo Taiwanese. And then on top of that, you had divisions between the so-called mainlanders and the Taiwanese Chinese. And part of this starts during the colonial period when Taiwanese Chinese had Japanese citizenship. They enjoyed Japanese citizenship, which meant that they could go over and act as, under the sort of Japanese flag to promote their interests against other Chinese in mainland China. So they did use this as to promote their own commercial interests and so on. But then later it becomes complicated when the nationalists lose the Civil War in 1949, and they come back and basically recolonize Taiwan and bring, and then you have mainlander Chinese rule over the native Taiwanese. And so this creates another sort of politicized division between different Chinese communities. So what's really interesting here is that the new work is exploring the sort of complexities of inter-Asian subjectivities and the ways that these differences sometimes are and sometimes are not racialized, and that changes over time. It's not a stable thing. And the ways that they become these racial and ethnic categories become mobilized for economic or political purposes They're available as a technology of rule, but also as a technology of resistance. Okay, so finally, this is and here I'll wrap up here. The other way that we are kind of rethinking categories of race in really transformative ways is the new work on post-colonialism and post-colonial identity politics. And here we see a new stream of books from the empire boom that seeks to really re-imperialize Japan. And by that I mean these books are forcing their readers, their Japanese readers, to think about Japan as a nation that lost its empire, to reimagine Japan as a post-imperial society. And this scholarship asks Japan to look at Asia as a former colonial sphere, and it asks Asia to look at Japan as a former colonial power. So, in other words, this sort of saturation coverage of the history of the empire is calling for a recognition in the present that Japan is a post-imperial society and that Asians in Japan have therefore, a post-colonial identity. Now, one of the really important sort of expressions of this and the way it connects to race is the critique of a widely held view that Japan is a racially homogeneous society. The new scholarship points out that no, Japan is not a racially homogeneous society. In fact, Japan is a multiracial society. But prior to the 1990s, this idea of a homogeneous Japan was really an article of faith. It was a very powerful racial myth, and it was connected to this kind of nationalist ideology of Japanese exceptionalism, known as Nihon Jinron. But this idea has always been a myth, but it's a myth that's rendered invisible all of these different minority populations, the outcast population known as the Burakumin, the Korean Japanese, the Zainichi, the Ainu, the Okinawans. These were all invisible minorities under this myth of the homogeneous Japanese race. And the other thing that this myth ignores is the history of the actual original settlement of the Japanese archipelago and the origins of from people coming in from Korea and Southeast Asia. But the point is that in the 90s, this myth comes more and more under attack. And we see then a new visibility of other Asians. Partially there's more immigrants, but also long-standing communities like the Korean Japanese begin to find a new voice, and they critique Japanese Orientalism, they critique Japanese race thinking, they critique Japanese discrimination, they critique Japan's kind of looking down on Asia, other countries in Asia, and their sort of arrogant attitudes towards other Asian countries, but also towards Asians in Japan. Okay, I'm going to wrap up here, and I hope that we will have some time. Yeah, we've got a good amount of time for questions. So thank you very much for your attention.